Cantrips are the community name for 1 or 2 mana spells that draws you a card and has some other additional effect. Oftentimes this includes letting you mess with the top card of your library to some degree, or sometimes they give you a totally different upside. Lots of these cards have been extremely successful. So today we're going to go over some of the best cantrips in all of Magic. And at number 10 we have Defiant Strike. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 white. It has the effect where target creature gets +1/+0 until the end of turn, and then you draw a card. Now this card doesn't really do enough on its own. While the card does draw you a card to replace itself, the impact on the game is so minimal, it just isn't worth the mana. 1 extra damage just isn't worth 1 mana on most board states. However, there are tons of cards that can take advantage of this card to make it a lot better. First off is the Heroic mechanic. This is a mechanic that triggers whenever you cast a spell that targets that creature. Creatures like Favorite Hoplite grow in size anytime you target them with a spell. And in the instance of Hoplite, it also becomes immune to damage for the rest of the turn, allowing it to attack far easier. Strike was great in these decks as it was a 1 mana spell, about as cheap as they come, that let you target one of your own creatures and drew you a card. That was all the card really needed to be good enough in these decks. Another place this card saw play was with Feather the Redeemed. This is a 3/4 angel that returns any instant or sorcery spell you cast that targets one of your own creatures to your hand at the next end step. With Defiant Strike, this lets you basically draw a free card every turn as long as you had 1 white mana to spend. This would usually let you run away with the game, especially since Feather also worked with cards like Reckless Rage. A powerful removal spell whose downside of dealing 2 damage to one of your creatures is a huge upside with Feather on the battlefield. Before we end this section, we should talk about Crash Through and Warlord's Fury. These are sorceries for 1 red that give your entire board a keyword, either Trample or First Strike, for the rest of the turn and draw you 1 card. These cards see play in Prowess decks built around casting as many instants and sorceries in 1 turn as they can pump on their board quickly. These cards actually see play in these decks specifically because they don't target, the opposite of Defiant Strike. You see, if a spell's target isn't there when it's supposed to resolve, the entire spell's effect will fizzle. So if your opponent kills your Defiant Strike target in response to the spell, you won't get to draw. But with a card like Crash Through that doesn't have a target, you'll always get your draw. Defiant Strike made on this list because it's seen a bit more play, but these cards have, at times, seen play in the same decks, so it's worth mentioning them. And at number 9, we have Explore. This is a sorcerer with a mana cost of 1 and 1 green. It has the effect where you can play an additional land this turn, and then draw you a card. This card is basically a side-graded Rampant Growth. Whereas Growth tutors a basic out of your deck, replacing itself with a land on the field, Explorer replaces itself with a random card from your deck and lets you get an extra land drop. Explorer has a few notable upsides, namely letting you play the land untapped, letting you use mana from it that turn, as well as letting you play non-basic lands. However, the risk of not having a land to play from your hand makes it a bit of a risky pick. Still, the ability to play extra non-basic lands is simply too good to pass up for many decks. Explorer sees a lot of play in land-based combo decks in Modern. This archetype of decks relies around a few specific cards, though exactly what they're playing can change depending on the build. The main focus of these decks is usually Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, a land that deals 3 damage to any target whenever a mountain enters the battlefield under your control, as long as you control at least 5 other mountains. This deck usually relies on either Primeval Titan or Escape Shift to cheat out a ton of mountains at once, allow them to start bolting their opponent's entire board or their face if they're ready to try and end the game. To do this, they usually use a combination of cards like Explore and Azusa Lost But Seeking to play additional lands, usually combining bounce lands with Amulet of Vigor. By combining these 2 cards, you can tap your bounce lands the turns you play them to make 2 mana that turn, letting you get a ton of extra mana on 1 turn with the additional land drops from the cards like Azusa. This has been the backbone of Amulet Titan and or Escape Shift decks in Modern for years, and Explore has usually been the 2 mana ramp spell of choice for these decks. And at number 8, we have Thought Scour. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has the effect where target player mills 2, then you draw a card. At first glance, this looks like a really bad mill effect. Milling 2 cards is far too little to get even close to entirely decking out your opponent. However, milling yourself can also be a very strong effect, and getting this effect without losing any card advantage can be really useful with the right cards. The first major way this card was used was alongside the Delve mechanic, which allowed you to exile cards from your graveyard to cast your spells, each card you exile paying for 1 mana. This means that a single Thought Scour can essentially pay for 3 mana for a Delve spell, and even better, it can pay for these spells on a much later turn. This led Thought Scour to see play with cards like Gurmag Angular and Tassigur the Golden Fang in formats like Modern and Legacy. The card also worked well with cards like Tolarian Terror, which had the ability where it costs 1 less to cast for each instant and or sorcery card in your graveyard. This card also has War 2, which forces your opponent to pay 2 extra mana to target it or their spells or abilities would be countered. This card isn't quite strong enough for formats like Modern or Legacy with all their powerful haymakers, but in the Pauper format, where only commons are legal, its imposing size and ward ability, along with being able to come down so early, has led to it being the cornerstone of one of the best decks in Pauper currently. Thought Scour's ability to fill your graveyard will likely come up again in the future whenever a new card comes out that's able to take advantage of the effect. And at number 7, we have Ancient Stirrings. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 green. It has the effect where you look at the top 5 cards in your library. You reveal a colorless card from among them and put it into your hand, then throw the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. The most common types of cards that this can grab are lands and artifacts. The card used to see a lot of play in land-based decks like Urzatron, though these decks could often have a hard time casting a spell since most of the lands make colorless mana. So these decks have moved more into cards like Inscribed Tablet that could be cast and activated with only colorless mana. However, one deck that has continued to use the card was Hardened Scales Affinity. This is a deck that uses +1/+1 counter-focus artifacts such as Arcbound Ravager, Walking Ballista, and Hangerback Walker, alongside the enchantment to give them a ton of +1/+1 counters incredibly quickly. All of these cards have ways of taking additional advantage of these counters, allowing the deck to put out explosive amounts of damage extremely quickly. For example, Ballista can remove its own counters to deal direct damage to any target. By combining this with the Ravager, which allows you to sacrifice artifacts to put extra +1/+1 counters on it, you can move them to any artifact creature when it dies. By combining these two cards together, you can push for a ton of damage by attacking with the Ravager, and then moving all of its counters to Ballista and firing them all into their opponent. Stirrings was a great consistency booster for these decks, letting them find their artifacts or additional land drops to put together these kinds of plays extremely early. Digging 5 cards deep is just far further than just about any other similar card that looks for cards, to the point that before cards like Mox Opal were banned in Modern, people discussed banning Stirrings instead. And at number 6, we have Manamorphose. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 and 1 hybrid red-green mana, which can be paid with either red or green mana. It has the effect where you add 2 mana of any combination of colors and you draw a card. While this card was probably initially intended to be sort of a one-shot mana fixing, the card has actually mostly been used as part of a combo deck. It goes great in the previously mentioned Prowess decks, as it gives your entire board a power boost without losing you any mana or cards, allowing you to cast even more spells and get for insane amounts of damage. The card also has seen play in combo decks built around the incredibly powerful Underworld Breach, an enchantment for 1 and 1 red that lets you recast cards from your graveyard for a turn, but you have to exile 3 cards from your graveyard to cast each one. These decks have led to Storm variants that try to cast a bunch of spells to get a massive grape shot to kill your opponent, as well as Prowess builds that splash Breach to get some truly frightening turns. Manamorphose has basically seen play in pretty much every deck that's been interested in casting lots of instants and sorceries throughout its long history of seeing play in Modern. And at number 5, we have Preordain. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has the effect where you scry 2, or look at the top 2 cards of your library, and either put them back on top or bottom of your library in however order you like, and then you draw a card. This is the first cantrip on this list that simply lets you move cards from your deck to your hand, no ifs, ands, or buts. Unlike Ancient Stirrings, it doesn't even ask you to play certain cards in your deck. These types of small consistency boosters are incredibly innocuous in the power level, but are essentially the glue that holds a deck together. Being able to find the cards you need for your combo or for a certain board state more consistently can help you win a ton of games you'd normally lose. The most common home for these kinds of cards is combo decks, as once you put your combo together, the loss in tempo ends up not mattering. Other decks have to contend more with the loss in tempo from not properly developing the board. In fact, this boost to consistency was so high that the card is currently banned in Modern to stop blue-based combo or spellslinger decks from taking over the format, along with another extremely powerful cantrip we'll talk about later on this list. And at number 4, we have Faithless Looting. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 red. It has the effect where you draw 2 cards and then discard 2. It also has flashback for 2/1 red, which lets you cast it again from your graveyard, but you have to exile it afterwards. This is the first and only card on this list that's actually card disadvantage, though I felt its ability to move cards around still qualified it as a cantrip for the list. The main upside of this card is actually its ability to discard cards. Normally, this is a huge downside, but there are plenty of cards that either like being discarded or like being in your graveyard. For example, Hollow 1 is a 4/4 artifact creature that costs 5 generic that has the ability where it costs 2 less to cast for each card you've cycled or discard this turn, with cycling being a keyword that lets you discard them for a cost to draw a card. This means that a single looting will make your Hollow 1's cost a single mana to cast, which is a great deal for a 4/4. Combine that with cards with the Madness mechanic like Blazing Rootwalla, which allows you to cast the card whenever you discard it, and in the case of Rootwalla, for 0 mana, and you can put a lot of bodies onto the battlefield extremely quickly. And this is only one deck that could take advantage of Looting's ability to fill your graveyard quickly. Tons of other decks, such as Mardu Pyromancer and Azet Phoenix, were breaking the card before it's banned in Modern. Honestly, the ability to flash the card back was really just icing on the cake of an already very powerful card. And at number 3, we have Ponder. This is a sorcerer that costs 1 blue and has the effect where you look at the top 3 cards of your library, then put them back on the top of your library in any order. You may choose to shuffle your library or not, then draw a card. This is the second blue cantrip that got banned in Modern, as I alluded to earlier. This card is far better at digging for cards in your deck than Preordain is, however. Getting to see 3 cards and choosing which one you want to draw is a lot of card selection for only 1 mana. And the ability to shuffle them all away if you don't see anything you want helps to make it very unlikely you'll completely blank on the cards you find. Seeing as this card is banned in Modern, its main home has been Legacy and a little bit of play in Vintage. There, just about every deck has tons of incredibly powerful cards that can change the course of a matchup. Even the fair decks will need to run cards like Force of Will to stop combo decks or powerful threats like Murktide Regent to end the game. In formats with such powerful cards, finding the right ones will often be the difference between winning and losing, especially in a format with quite a bit of free spells in it. Of course, finding parts of your combos is usually far more important in those decks considering just how strong those combos are for formats like Legacy. And at number 2, we have Gitaxian Probe. This is a sorcery with a mana cost of 1 Phyrexian blue mana, which can be paid with either 1 blue or 2 life. It has the effect where you look at target player's hand and then you draw a card. This effect actually appears on other cards such as Peak, which has the exact same mana cost but without the ability to pay 2 life instead of paying the blue mana. So, how important is being able to cast this spell for 0 mana? Well, it turned out to be kind of game-breaking. This card has also been banned in several formats due to just how good it is at letting combo decks play around interaction. Knowing exactly what cards your opponent has access to lets you know the best possible ways to play around their interaction. Knowing if you need to hold off on your combo turn or if the coast is clear to combo off is extremely powerful when you're playing a deck that can just win the game in 1 turn. And unlike Peak, Probe doesn't use up any of your mana to cast it, allowing you to much more easily be able to take a look at your opponent's hand and still have mana to pull off your combo. On top of that, since the card is basically free, it's also a great card for those aforementioned prowess decks that love to cast as many instants and sorcerers as they can on their turn. And to check in their hand for removal and knowing if you need to keep your Spell Piercer up for combat that turn is also extremely powerful. Basically, this is a card that gives you a huge upside for basically no downside at all. And at number 1, we have Brainstorm. This is an instant with a mana cost of 1 blue. It has the effect where you draw 3 cards, then put 2 cards from your hand on top of your library. Brainstorm is probably the most subtly broken card in the game. It looks like it's quite a bit worse than something like Ancestral Recall, and it almost doesn't even look like it's really doing anything since you'll normally have to draw into the 2 cards you put back anyway. However, there are tons of little ways to make this card better. First off, there are lots of cards, particularly fetch lands, which allow you to shuffle your library. This means that in the best case scenario, Brainstorm can replace itself and 2 other bad cards in your hand with 3 good cards. If the cards you were getting rid of were dead in the matchup, that's pretty close to a recall. Even without shuffling, the ability to, at instant speed, for a single mana, look at 3 new cards to try and find an answer can save you in a lot of situations. It can also be incredibly useful against Thoughtseize effects. By simply casting it in response to a discard spell, you can hide the best cards in your hand on top of your library where your opponent can't discard them and draw into them on your next turn. Brainstorm is basically 70% of a recall, and 70% is way too much for basically any format. Lots of people have said the card should probably just get the axe already in Legacy, and the card is restricted to a single copy in Vintage, the strongest format of Magic. The card even had to be banned in Historic, a much weaker format without fetch lands to make the card better. Brainstorm is just far too good at giving you the cards you need when you need them, and easily takes number 1 spot on this list. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other cantrip cards that we may have missed, or have any ideas for future videos just like this one? If so, we'd love to hear about them down in the comments below.